and welcome, Steve Taylor.
Hi, Paul. Great to be with you.
I'm so happy you are here. So, do you know, we've got a number of books we could actually talk about. You're the author. Is there 14 books?
14, yeah. Yeah, that's right.
That is quite a feat. But there seems to be a theme of waking up. So I'd like to start there about what does waking up actually mean? Is this a spiritual term or does it relate to something else?
It is expressed through spirituality, but I'm a psychologist, so I like to interpret spirituality through a psychological perspective. So you can actually look at it in separation from spiritual traditions. But it's basically, well, I think it all stems from my feeling, which I always had when I was younger, and which I still have now, that normal human awareness is quite limited. And obviously it varies to some degree, but the state of awareness which most people experience is quite narrow. You know, it's quite kind of egocentric, and it gives us a fairly narrow perspective on reality. But there are certain moments when our awareness seems to expand and intensify. I call those awakening experiences, and I used to have them myself when I was a teenager. Initially, you know, I'd sort of have these moments when my awareness would seem to intensify. Things would become more real. I'd feel a sense of connection to my surroundings. Things would look more beautiful, and everything seemed to be sort of in harmony. And you know, it seemed to me that my awareness was expanding and intensifying. And you know, I became a psychologist partly because I wanted to understand these experiences and why they occur.
Oh wow, how old were you when you were experiencing this sort of connected with your surroundings? What age were you?
Probably about 16 when it began. And obviously, I didn't really understand what was happening. I thought I was crazy at the time. You know, I thought it was kind of more evidence that there was something wrong with me, and
Okay.
I would never be able to fit into into normal society.
And did you ask people around you, oh, I've experienced this. Has anyone else experienced this? Did you explore it with anyone else?
No, no, because I sort of understood intuitively that people wouldn't understand that. And my parents would not have understood that. They would have probably. I mean, I was quite an unusual teenager. I was incredibly quiet. I was kind of quite withdrawn and introverted. So my parents were already sort of a bit worried about me. So I sensed that if I told my parents, they'd send me to see a psychiatrist.
Okay.
And yeah, I just had a feeling that, you know, people would not understand the experiences. And so I kept them to myself. And I didn't really understand them until I was in my early 20s when I discovered books on mysticism and spirituality. And I recognized that other people had these experiences too.
Yeah, do you know, I was going back to the spiritual side of things. I was reading through some of your essays on your website. There's so much information there for people. And in one of the articles, you said you were an atheist. Is that correct? Or so is that has something changed at all? Is there an evolution?
No, no. Obviously, it depends on how you define the term atheist. But I don't believe in a personal God. I am not
Yeah.
religious. I'm not.
Okay.
I don't adhere to any religion. But I would call myself spiritual. There's this term spiritual, but not religious. That's how I would describe myself.
Okay.
So, but I'm not a materialist. I don't believe that the physical material world is the ultimate reality, and I don't believe you can explain human experience in purely physical terms. I believe that there is, you know, there's more to the universe than we understand or are aware of.
Yeah, I think that's such a great answer. So, because there's this weird spiritual shaming. I speak to a few guests, and everyone says, "Oh, yeah, it's a bit woo-woo," and you know, almost like it's almost like an apologetic. Oh, I believe in this, and it's slightly embarrassing. And I think I've done it myself. You know, it's I had a spiritual awakening when I was younger. Then I threw everything out. I threw everything out. I went atheist. And I would say that I've had another spiritual awakening over the past few years. So it's been quite the journey. But it's the term spiritual seems to have that sort of slightly embarrassing connection to it.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, it's quite a nebulous term. Nobody really understands what it refers to, and it does have this association with woo. But to me, spiritual what it means is connections. To be spiritual means to have a spiritual experience means to become connected to other human beings, towards nature, even to your own deeper self. It means to expand your awareness and to transcend separation. And I think a lot of people. I think the problem is that a lot of people associate the term spiritual with religion. A lot of religious people use the term spiritual
Yeah.
with a religious meaning. You hear it all the time on Thought for the Day on Radio 4, with the various religious leaders. There's nothing wrong with that, of course, but it's not what I mean by spiritual. Spiritual has nothing to do with religion. It sometimes overlaps with the religion. Religious people are sometimes quite spiritual, but sometimes religious people are not spiritual at all, and sometimes non-religious people are very spiritual. I would put myself in that category. I'm non-religious, but I'm spiritual. I believe that there is some kind of spiritual force in the universe, not a personal force, but there's some sort of ground reality in the universe of a kind of spiritual nature, which expresses itself through us and in our actions.
Yeah, and going on that, I would say that this has probably come from your experiences with that spiritual force. What's it been like for you?
Well, to me, I mean, obviously, it depends on your state of consciousness. There are certain states of consciousness where you can sort of, these things are quite difficult to describe, but you can sort of perceive aspects of some sort of spiritual force in the world. I mean, the most sort of essential aspect of spiritual experiences or mystical experiences is a feeling of oneness, a sense that things are not really separate. Things are in some way interdependent, not in a kind of a psychological or abstract sense, but in a real tangible sense. Everything is interconnected. Everything seems to be the manifestation of something more fundamental, and every mystical experience features that realization, and that includes our own being, that we feel that we are not separate. We are part of this wider reality. We are one, essentially one with all things. We are one with the universe, and that is a tangible reality. In my sort of highest, most awakened moments, I have experienced that. I've experienced, an awareness that the essence of my own being, the kind of spiritual essence, or you could call it consciousness, it's one with the consciousness of the world or the universe. Essentially, they stem from the same source.
I think that's such a beautiful answer in regards to what spirituality is and what the awakened experience can feel like. I've experienced very similar during meditation. Is it during meditation that you'd experience something like that, or is there another practice which
sometimes?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, there are obviously different varieties of awakening experiences or mystical experiences, and sometimes people who study these experiences make a distinction between what they call extrovertive experiences, which are experiences of oneness with nature, or experiences in which all natural things or even man-made things seem to be interlinked and seem to be full of spirit or consciousness. But there are also what people call introvertive experiences, which usually occur in meditation when your eyes are closed and you're kind of exploring your own consciousness, and your mind becomes very quiet and your whole being seems to settle into a feeling of calmness and serenity. And then you can get the same feeling in an inward sense, a feeling that you're aware of a source of consciousness, a fundamental consciousness which expresses itself in your own being, but actually expresses itself everywhere. So there's a feeling of oneness in a more kind of formless sense.
It does. I remember the experiences I've had. I've had them in meditation, and I've had them. I had bizarrely when I go skiing, when I'm just.
It's funny you should say that.
Yeah, flying down a slope. It's strange. I suddenly just feel like you're one with everything. And if there's a moment of nervousness, I can even hear this voice, and it's very deep. It's almost like a gentle whisper rumbling that says, "Oh, just do this, just do this." It's almost like a sense of intuition. So you said it's funny I sent that. What came up for you?
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that because I'm writing a new book at the moment on experiences of timelessness or experiences of
Yeah.
expansive time. And I've got a chapter on sporting experiences of time expansion and timelessness. And I use some quotes from skiers. So I think
All
it's
right.
probably not an uncommon experience in skiers, that feeling of oneness and that feeling that everything you do, something's guiding you in the right direction and protecting you even.
Yeah, it's a beautiful
So
sense of
I've
flow.
never been
It's
skiing.
uh,
Yeah.
I'd recommend it. I really would recommend it. But there's a sense of flow because you ski so much better when you just go into that flow state. So you can be in that heightened,
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
adrenaline and there's a little bit of, there's anxiety because you are hurtling down a mountain on two pieces of wood. And then suddenly it's just bliss, just, timelessness is a good description where you just feel like you're everything. And then there's this voice that seems to be
Wow.
guiding you gently. Yeah. So it is a beautiful state.
Yeah. It sounds wonderful. Yeah. I mean, I have, like I say, I've never been skiing, but I've had similar experiences with different
Mm.
sporting activities. I really love playing sport, and I play tennis and go swimming and go running. And sometimes even in playing tennis, it's quite strange. I love to play tennis outdoors, in the
Yeah.
park, surrounded by nature. And sometimes there's a similar feeling that whatever you do is sort of some occasionally it just seems to be natural and spontaneous and perfect, and there's a feeling of oneness with your body and with your actions and
Mm.
with your surroundings, with my surroundings. I also love to swim outdoors. So a couple of weeks ago, we went to the Lake District and went swimming
Yeah.
in Grasmere,
Lovely.
surrounded by beautiful scenery, and it was a really blissful experience of feeling of oneness with the water, feeling of natural mindfulness, I guess you'd call it. There's no, you don't make an effort to be mindful, but it's just you are just naturally in a state of presence because it's so beautiful and you feel so there's a feeling of union with the water and nature.
Yeah, it reminds me of I interviewed Jake Eagle, who did the book The Power of Awe, and he talks about microdosing mindfulness. It's those little moments of
Yeah.
pure bliss that you just get in moments like that. And he talks about the impact that has on our physiology, um, and the benefits mentally and physically. What why would someone want to be awakened? I know it sounds quite amazing to be connected and to feel like you're one with everything. Um, but why would someone
Mm.
want? Is that something that I'm trying to get a good question here in regards to how easy is that to do, and is it something that someone would want to do regularly? Is that a good thing?
Well, I mean, I think it's natural to a large degree. I think there is an impulse in all living beings to grow, not just physically, but psychologically or inwardly. And awakening experiences are part of our development. And awakening is not just an experience; it's also a developmental process. It's a journey of awakening. So, so individual awakening experiences are part of the whole journey of awakening. And I think it's a kind of evolution. The whole of evolution is about growth. It's about expansion, moving towards increased awareness, increased complexity. And I think our own individual spiritual journey is part of that too. That's why it often feels very natural for people to embark on some kind of spiritual or personal developmental journey, because it's part of that whole evolutionary process that life has been part of that process for millions of years. So it feels, and that's why it feels so natural. And also, well, I think we know intuitively that there is something not quite right about our normal experience of the world.
Mm.
It's not quite right for human beings to live in a state of psychological discord. Most of us live in a state of with some degree of psychological discord. A feeling of like inner restlessness and unease, a feeling that something's not quite right. And I think we all sense that this is not the end of the story. There is a we do have a potential. We do have the potential to attain a state of harmony, or at least to move beyond our discord and suffering. So I think many people spend their lives kind of escaping from the inner discord be living in a state of constant activity or distraction. But I think many people do feel a strong impulse to transcend that state through, spiritual awakening.
I think you're right. I do think people get a sense that there's something not quite right if they're not. I think the wrong word is disconnected, or their connection is weakened, where they're too distracted, they're over focused on, materialism, extrinsic values. What do you think is going on to prevent people from feeling more connected, to having more in the way of awakening experiences?
That's a good question. I think, these experiences are not particularly socially accepted. We're all brought up with a certain degree of social conditioning, and our social conditioning tells us that, we need to be active. We need to accumulate possessions. We need to accumulate success and so forth. And we need to, if we want to seek happiness, the best way to seek happiness is through that process of accumulation, and also by giving ourselves as many doses of pleasure as we can through food or substances or through distractions and entertainments. There's nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't really work as a long-term strategy for happiness. So if you want to discover real happiness, you've got to first discover that those processes don't work. It doesn't work. There's no connection between money and happiness beyond a certain basic point anyway. And beyond a certain point, entertainments and fun and pleasure, it brings a certain degree of enjoyment, but it doesn't bring lasting happiness. But you first got to go through that. You've got to sort of undo that social conditioning, I think, before you realise that happiness lies in more, in other pursuits.
I think that's a great answer. And if someone starts to experience being awakened out of these pursuits, so they begin to explore and they have a moment of feeling connected and oneness, and experiencing, consciousness in a very different way. Is that something then that repeats itself, or is it something that they have to work at? What advice would you give to someone who's seeking to be awakened, basically?
Well, it's both of those things, really. Once it begins, it has its own momentum. And once you have that experience, it's so profound and powerful that you want to go back there. It's like once you glimpse beauty and you know that beauty lies in a certain place, you always return there, So that's one thing. But also, like as I said before, I think, deep down, most people probably feel this impulse towards personal growth, towards transcending their normal state of discord and unease. So once you attune to that process, then it grows. Once it manifests itself, it never, it's always there. You can't cover it up again. It flourishes as soon as you uncover it, it begins to flourish, and it has its own momentum, which takes you further.
So what would you say to someone, what would be, besides like meditation, being in nature, is that the sort of thing that you'd advise someone to keep up with their, awakening, or is there something else that they could begin to become more aware of or focus on?
Meditation, is a great way of inducing individual awakening experiences, and also a great way of cultivating ongoing wakefulness in the long term. But there are lots of other practices besides meditation itself, and some of the things we've mentioned as well. Contact with nature is a really powerful method of inducing awakening. I think there's a certain stillness within nature that we naturally attune to when we are in the midst of it, and we feel this natural connection, and our sense of separation begins to fade away. But also service and altruism. Every spiritual tradition recommends altruism and service as an important aspect of their developmental system. So I often recommend that people should consciously practice altruism and service Because when you practice altruism and service, you feel a natural connection to other people. It's another way of transcending your selfishness and separateness. And you seem to attune to something bigger than yourself. Maybe it's even that fundamental spirit or consciousness we mentioned earlier. I think altruism and service attune you to that deep part of your nature, which you share with others. And I personally think that exercise is a great way of cultivating spirituality too. Because some spiritual traditions have a rather negative attitude to the body. They see the body as a kind of a vehicle, or even as a kind of enemy. But the body is an expression of spirit. It's pervaded with spirit. So physical exercise helps us to attune to the body's spiritual nature, and it cultivates inner harmony.
I love that. Well, I exercise quite a lot, so I'm all for that. So, as my listeners know, I talk about it quite a lot, and I do. You do feel, especially when I go running, I swim. You do get that, So I can relate to what you were saying. It's especially when you're running, and even just certain types of music just seem to trigger this sudden euphoric feeling. Where you can have these amazing insights, and it just feels beautiful. And I just think it can't get any better than this. Sometimes when I'm running, especially on a sunny day.
I know exactly what you mean, especially on a beautiful morning, running in the park or in nature on a beautiful sunny morning. I think a lot of it is that. All of these activities have a mind quietening effect. They help to slow down our thoughts. They turn our attention away from our thoughts. I think the thought mind, is the source of a lot of the suffering we experience, and attuning to your body takes you away from the thought mind and brings you into oneness with your body. And it's a great way of transcending all the suffering which our minds create.
No, I agree with that. And just from what you just said, brings to mind a documentary I saw recently called "How to Change Your Mind." It was talking about psilocybin, and how people on psilocybin had their default mode network dissolved, if you like, which seems to house the ego. And when that dissolves, the common experience was to fill it one with everything. Have you looked more into that? I'm guessing that's part of flow states and awakening, or
that's a kind of neurological way of describing what happens in meditation or in the kind of exercises we've just discussed. But psychedelics is one way of experiencing that too. It is quite difficult to identify the neurological correlates of any psychological experiences, really. But that seems to be what they're suggesting that the ego dissolves away. But I'm a little bit, I'm aware of a lot of the positive research which is going on into psychedelics, and I know, don't tell my kids, but a long time ago I experimented with psychedelics too.
Okay.
And I had some positive experiences which were helpful. I know a lot of the people who've been helped by these experiences, but I don't think psychedelics are offer a route towards awakening. You can't use them as a regular spiritual practice in the same way that you use meditation. You could try, but I think there are certain risks that come with psychedelics.
Yeah, no, and I think that's fair enough. And obviously, as you talked about your kids, when you obviously, as you were studying, you're a psychology lecturer, you're a teacher. When you had children, obviously you've got a family now. Is that something that can take you away from being awakened? Because I work with a lot of parents in the anxiety side of things, and the lack of sleep, and just normal parenting. It can be quite stressful. So what's it been like for you, and being awakened and having children? What's that like?
Interesting question, because in a lot of spiritual traditions, people are encouraged to be celibate, because not just for to conserve their sexual energy, but because having a family takes their attention away from spiritual development. But I think for me personally, it actually contributed to my spiritual development quite significantly. Obviously, it was difficult to find time to meditate. Obviously, there was a lack of sleep, and it was difficult to find time to write my books and so forth. but in a way, being a parent is all about altruism. You couldn't be more altruistic than a parent who wakes up at 4 a.m. to tend to their baby and devotes their whole life to service towards their children. So it's a path of altruism. And as I said before, altruism is a very important spiritual practice. But other things as well. One thing I gained from having children was, mindfulness, because young children are always mindful. They live in a state of presence. They are just naturally mindful. So when you have young children, you're encouraged to be mindful along with them. When you play with your kids, you're in a state of mindfulness. You forget all of your thought activity, all of your concerns and worries, and you slow down, because young children walk very slowly. They veer off in all kinds of directions. So you're forced to be in the moment along with them. You're forced to slow down and be present. So for me, it was, it was helpful.
I love that.
In those senses.
Yeah, I love that answer. And as they were growing up, did they kind of challenge your work? How do they feel about your awakening philosophy, beliefs? Did they say, "Don't try that awakening stuff on me, Dad"? I don't want to. I'm not interested. Is there been resistance?
A little bit in a jokey way. They say, "Oh, don't be so spiritual, Dad." So now children, they're naturally a little bit rebellious, and teenagers anyway. They become a bit rebellious, and as a part of creating their own identity. But now that my kids are a bit older, they've kind of naturally developed an interest in these things. My son is studying psychology, and they've started to ask me questions about meditation, but why I do it and why I feel it's helpful. And we brought them up to do the things we talked about. We brought them up to be very sporty and to enjoy contact with nature. So I think they gain, without realizing, they gain sort of spiritual benefits from these things. But anyway, if I told them that, then they may not do them anymore. But
okay, don't let them listen to this podcast episode. Then it doesn't exist. So what I wanted then to move on to was we're looking at obviously your children have been quite receptive by the sounds of things. Do you have a new book coming out and it's called Disconnected? Is it out now? Your book Disconnected, is it out?
It is out. Yeah, it came out a few weeks ago.
Lovely. Congratulations. How's it doing? Are you pleased?
Seems to be doing okay. Yeah, I've not seen any reviews yet, but I've had some good responses from people.
Brilliant. Can you tell me a little bit more about this book? Because I was reading, I've not had a chance to read it because I contacted you literally just a few days ago, and magically you're here already. So, but I've been having a look, and I think it's such a timely book for the day and age we are living in. So can you tell me a little bit more about what the book premise is and why, especially, my listeners should be definitely going out and buying this book?
It's my attempt to explain human behavior, really. It's my attempt to explain why human beings, differ so much in their behavior. Sometimes we can be incredibly cruel and brutal and violent. Other times, other people can be incredibly kind and compassionate. So I wanted to understand the extremes, or this entire spectrum of human nature. So I had a model which I called the continuum of connection, and the book kind of covers the whole continuum. It begins with people who are extremely disconnected, people who are living at the kind of in the polar opposite state to spirituality, in that they are completely disconnected from nature, from other human beings, even completely disconnected from their own bodies. They have these incredibly strong and solid egos which separate them from the world. And because they're so separate, they don't have empathy. So their lack of empathy permits them to be cruel and manipulative and exploitative. So I explain, the cruelty and oppression which human beings are capable of in those terms. And I've got a few chapters where I explain how these people, who I call them hyper disconnected, the people who have no empathy towards others, I call them hyper disconnected people. And I explain, why they are drawn to power. They are drawn to positions of power in society, particularly in politics. So if you look at politicians, you'll find many examples, or some examples at least, of these hyper disconnected people with psychopathic or narcissistic traits.
Are we talking?
But the other, sorry, carry on.
Are we talking Trump and Putin as in great examples of this? As in just two people that literally they're very dominant in the news these days. Is that an example?
Yeah, they are quite extreme examples. But even here in the UK, where I live, there are many examples in the UK government. Boris Johnson is a good example, but also several members of the Conservative government's cabinet are obviously people with narcissistic and psychopathic traits, unfortunately. But yeah, these people are drawn to power like moths to a flame.
Why is that? What's going on for them there?
It's because they are so separate, because they are so disconnected. They feel a sense of incompleteness, a feeling of lack, as if there's something desperately missing from them. So they feel this compensatory impulse to accumulate power, success, or wealth, just to compensate for their sense of lack. They're trying to sort of complete themselves by accumulating power and wealth. And it doesn't work. No matter how much wealth or power they gain, they never feel satisfied. So they continually grasp for more and more, and usually in ever more destructive ways.
And why do you think they're so popular?
That's the reason why.
Yeah, why do you think they're so popular? Though that's the it's mystifying for me. It's like Boris Johnson, Putin, Trump. These are people that lots of people really have a lot of time for. Which
that's true.
For me, I find it a bit alien.
It is mystifying.
What do you think's going on?
It is mystifying, but because these people are so disconnected, and because of their narcissistic and psychopathic traits, they lack normal human emotions we mentioned empathy, but also emotions like guilt. They don't feel fear or nervousness, so they project a sense of strength, which is kind of illusory, but they project it because they don't have these emotions. So ordinary people who do feel inhibitions and who do feel guilt and embarrassment and fear, they look at these people and think, wow, I wish I was like him. And they also project charisma. They use their charisma as a way of manipulating people. Again, it comes from their lack of fear, their lack of nervousness, and their desire to manipulate people. But because they present themselves as powerful figures, powerful paternal figures, I think they appeal to an impulse in some people to return to a kind of childlike state when your parents took responsibility for your life and protected you from the world and took care of everything. I call that the abdication syndrome. It operates in some spiritual communities with cult leaders and fake gurus, but also in politics too, with people like Trump, or with Putin, also with Hitler and Stalin decades ago. It's the same syndrome.
No, it's just a fascinating subject, and because what's the these people are quite disconnected, but what's the cost? It's to never feel satisfied. What else? What other costs are there that comes from a lack of connection?
For them, the cost is that they, as you say, they never feel satisfied. They can't have real human relationships, because real human relationships obviously stem from empathy and compassion and trust and connection. And so these people can't have those emotions. So there's a kind of emotional void inside these people because they have no connection to others. And also, they can't experience real happiness, because I suggest in the book that all the moments of happiness that we human beings experience are related to connection. They're related to connection to nature, connection to other people, and also connection to our own deeper self, or connection to a certain activity which brings a state of flow. But because these people are so separate, they can't experience those moments of happiness. So they live in a state of continual frustration and emptiness, which manifests itself in ever more destructive behavior. That's why there's a terrible destructiveness at the heart of these people. You know, there's a terrible destructiveness at the heart of people like Trump and Putin. They just, fundamentally, they just want to create chaos and destruction because they're, I think fundamentally they're so frustrated.
And do you think that's because we are witnessing? I'm an eternal optimist, so sometimes I think these things are happening to people. So they're going into almost like crisis mode. They're getting very angry. They're getting frustrated. There's mental health issues on the rise. It can look very bleak if we looked at it in that way. But going back to the waking up side of things, do you think a lot of people are going through what it can be quite a dark time for themselves because it's those crisis points which can begin to wake them up?
That's right. I mean, this is the kind of the other part of my new book, that there is a process of connection as well. And I think there is a process of connection underway in the world in the midst of, despite all of the terrible things and all the crises which are occurring, or maybe even because of these crises. I mean, one of the areas which I've researched as a psychologist is the transformational power of crisis. The transformational power of psychological turmoil and trauma. And it is when people go through crises in their lives, that's when they undergo significant growth. And sometimes when our lives are running smoothly and comfortably, we switch off, we sort of lull ourselves into a state of sleep. So we need challenges and crises to wake us up sometimes. We need challenges and crises to burrow down into ourselves and find our deep resources of resilience and inner confidence. So, I think the crises that we're facing now could be collectively having that kind of effect.
Yeah, I wonder, because, if we go from the theory that life is happening for us, not to us, and that this is whatever it appears to be is for our highest good. If we went down that lines, I'm wondering if this is just a way to create a collective awakening because people are getting that fed up with their current circumstances and lives. So you can see the anger in, the way that people are protesting these days, like Just Stop Oil, for example, and the way that they're, upsetting other people. There's these battles. And I find the psychology around that quite fascinating. But I think it all leads towards maybe people develop, connecting with themselves to find out what they can do to solve what it is that they're going through. And that works collectively too.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I think that's right. I think there is a collective, ever increasing dissatisfaction with, our cultural paradigm, or with the cultural conditioning of our society. I mean, I think fundamentally it's a dissatisfaction with the materialist paradigm of our society, which tells us that natural things are just there to be exploited, and that the purpose of life is just to survive and enjoy ourselves or become successful. Fundamentally, it's the view that human beings are just purely physical objects. It doesn't really matter because we are born by accident, and after a number of years, we're going to die and be nothing forevermore. So it doesn't really matter what happens while we're here. We can just enjoy ourselves and try to take as much from the world as we can. But I think people are realizing now that paradigm is totally destructive, it's nihilistic, and it doesn't lead to any happiness. So I think in a variety of ways, people are exploring different ways of different worldviews and different activities that question the values that we live by.
Yeah, and I think with the explosion of social media, even though it has its dark side, is that people are being more exposed to more than ever the idea of waking up and what it could do for them. Something I forgot to mention earlier with you, and I said I would mention it, is the more I feel connected, the more I go into flow states. So when I'm writing, when I'm meditating, when I'm exercising, the bizarre thing that seems to happen with that are the synchronicities which seem to flow into my life, where, like, for example, I found my attic is being taken down. I found your books because I put them up there for safe storage. And I thought, he'd be great to come onto the show. Within a few days, you're actually here and we were having this great conversation. And it's there's this like synchronicity of I've been exploring more than ever the idea of waking up, and actually I've got one of the world's best people to talk about it to here now. Is this something that you've experienced? Do you know? Is there like I've talked to a few authors about this before, but is this something that you've experienced with synchronicity? The more you're in flow, the more you're in awakened state.
Yeah, I used to. I used to know a psychologist. It was a guy called David Fontana, who was quite a well-known author. Maybe 50, I think he died about 15 years ago. But he used to say that if you meditate for an hour a day every morning, synchronicities will happen. Your life will be full of synchronicities. I think that's true. When I'm in flow, when I'm meditating regularly and feel most attuned to myself, I notice a lot more synchronicities. And it is, I think it goes back to connection. I think, synchronicities are really just a sign that everything is interconnected. Synchronicities are just evidence of the fundamental interconnection of everything. But I think you've got to be connected to your own essential nature. You've got to be, rather than your sort of ego mind, you've got to be attuned to your essential nature to experience those synchronicities. I mean, they will probably happen anyway, but I think they will happen more regularly in a state of attunement.
Yeah, I think even when there appears to be something going wrong, it's interesting how suddenly there's a synchronicity that links to taking you in a different direction than the path that you were going to take. So there's like an obstacle, and you're like, why is that there? Then suddenly you can see why it's there when something even more profound or even better is going to take place that would benefit you. So I find, as I said, I find the whole thing quite fascinating, how it's like even anything that appears to be a block seems to be a way forward.
That's right. It is almost as if something's giving you a hint to go in a certain direction or not to go in a certain direction. And sometimes I've had that feeling, with strange coincidences or synchronicities. There's a feeling that accompanies them. It's like, this is a reminder. This is a reminder that everything is interconnected. This is a reminder that you're on the right path. I get that feeling quite strongly sometimes, as if it's coming from somewhere deep inside me. Did you have that feeling?
Yeah, that is I could exactly that. It's just like you're on the right path. You're on the right path. And the one time I doubted it, I wasn't skiing at the time, but I'd just come down a slope, and I had the most amazingly strong feeling that someone I knew was near me. So I was looking around and I was thinking, where are they? And it was so overwhelming. And I was thinking, why am I getting this really wrong? I can't even see them. So anyway, I ended up thinking, I'm going to give up on this. So ended up going up a slope, coming back down. And then when I got to the bottom, one of my friends came up and said, I was trying to get your attention. I could see you looking around for me, but, they were waving, but for some reason I didn't see them. And I took from that to trust that feeling. I might not have seen them physically, but they were there. They were there trying to get my attention.
Yeah.
It was a strange thing.
I also think that these experiences, they veer into sort of psychic experiences almost. They veer into a kind of telepathy, So I'm quite interested in psi phenomena, and there is a lot of evidence. I think there is incontrovertible evidence that phenomena like telepathy and precognition exist. So I think synchronicities are sometimes the result of, a kind of telepathic connection between two people.
Yeah, there's a lot of information about that, and you've opened up a whole can of worms now. But unfortunately, as I said, I'd only keep you here for this long. Damn it, I'm joking. We'll have to have you back to talk about this a bit further. Maybe is that a topic of maybe another book for you then, Steve?
Well, I did write about it. I wrote a book called Spiritual Science, which was published maybe 4 years ago, where I talked about psi phenomena. And it's kind of an ongoing interest of mine. And I think there was growing acceptance of these phenomena because the evidence is sort of, so, more and more experiments are being conducted in very kind of rigorous laboratory settings, and they're having positive results. So,
well, I am going to look into that further.
This is part of the kind of changing paradigm where people are more open to these anomalous experiences.
Amazing. That is definitely something I have to look into. Steve, you've been absolute gold. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. Your book, Disconnected, is out now. I'm going to put a link in the show notes. But if people wanted to find out more about your work, where can they go to?
The best place is my website, which is stephenmtaylor.com. That's Stephen with a V, M for Mark, stephenmtaylor.com. So I've got links to my social media pages, and there are lots of poems and articles. And I also have a podcast, which you can get access to through my website. So that's the best place, I think.
Brilliant. I should have got you to read some of your poetry on
Yeah,
here. I
thanks,
was
Paul.
listening to you online. Yeah, it's so good. It really is. It's almost like a meditation just listening to you, read your poetry, because it doesn't rhyme, but you talk about that, but there's something that it seems to touch deep inside when you're just listening to those words that is quite profound.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I get a lot of ideas for poems when I go running, actually running or swimming. My mind empties and phrases or lines pop into my head. So they seem to come from a mysterious place.
Well, I will put the links to all your work in the show notes. I hope you have a brilliant rest of the day. And to anyone
Yeah, you too.
listening, thank you for listening, and I'll connect with you again soon.